Churches are closing in Quebec at the rate of one parish per week, and Mass attendance, once at 90%, is now at an all-time low of only 6%. Quebec has one of the highest abortion rates in the world. What's going on in Canada? How did things get so bad? In this episode of FBI Faith-Based Investigations, we'll take an in-depth look into what has caused this Canadian collapse. Canada was once a bastion for Catholicism, where the faith flourished for centuries. Unlike in the United States, the Catholic Church held favored status in Canada and exercised enormous influence over all aspects of society. So it's all the more grievous that the implosion of the faith in Canada happened more swiftly and completely than with her American neighbors. The Church in the United States was an outsider from the very founding of the colonies. Catholics were very much in the minority in a hostile Protestant world and were treated like second-class citizens. The American bishops found themselves in the position of seeking acceptance from their Protestant peers and begging for a seat at the table in the public square. This desire for acceptance could at times lead to compromise, something Pope Leo XIII warned against in his encyclical on the heresy of Americanism. But the bishops in French-speaking Canada were in no such position. They were the ruling class, governing both the public and private sectors of society, where Catholics comprised the vast majority of the populace. So why the swift and stunning downfall of the faith? Let's go back to the beginning to examine the roots of this collapse. The Catholic faith arrived to Canada in 1497 with John Cabot, who landed on the shores of Newfoundland holding a crucifix and banners bearing the papal arms. The first known Mass on Canadian soil took place a few decades later, in 1534, when the priest who traveled with the explorer, Jacques Cartier, offered Mass on the shores of the Gaspé Peninsula. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded the first Catholic colony in Quebec. And 12 years later, George Calvert, the man who helped found Maryland, America's only Catholic colony, started a Catholic mission in Newfoundland. French Catholics helped spread the faith in New France, sending over Franciscans, Jesuits, Sulpicians, Ursulines, Hospitallers of St. Joseph, and Augustinians to found seminaries, hospitals, and schools. The famous North American martyrs, including Saints Jean de Brebeuf and Isaac Jogues, witnessed to the faith in their heroic death at the hands of Native Americans. The dedication and courage of these early missionaries caused the faith to take root and flourish in Canada. In spite of the defeat of the French by British forces in 1759, French Catholicism continued to grow. In 1774, Great Britain issued the Quebec Act, guaranteeing French Canada the free practice of the Catholic faith, which, by the way, outraged Protestant members of the U.S. Continental Congress and was one of the grievances colonists had against Great Britain that led to the American Revolution. But the faith continued to spread into English Canada. Dioceses were established throughout the English-speaking provinces in the 1800s, going as far west as British Columbia. Quebec was the epicenter of the faith. French author Paul Claudel called it the Tibet of Catholicism. Quebec was a shining star in the Canadian Catholic firmament with a vibrant and orthodox Catholic faith. This remained true as late as the mid-20th century. In 1958, more than 85% of the population self-identified as Catholic, and nearly 90% of that number attended Mass regularly. Around 50,000 priests and religious ran the Church's massive bureaucracy, taught at its schools and staffed its hospitals. Villages and streets bore the names of saints, and municipalities were given the Catholic designation of parishes. In Parliament, a strong contingent of faithful Catholics held the line against laws liberalizing divorce, contraception, and abortion. And the French version of Canada's national anthem includes a refrain that the nation will carry the sword and the cross. French Catholicism, centered in Quebec, without question exercised the greatest influence on the rest of Catholic Canada. But in the mid-20th century, things took a downturn. Quebec became the starting point of the Revolution. From there, the Revolution spread like a cancer to the rest of Canada. When France was ousted by Great Britain in 1759, the French-speaking Canadians became a conquered people. The reaction was not to assimilate themselves into the culture of their British conquerors, but rather to resist, entrenching themselves more firmly in their French Catholic identity. This gave rise to a French Catholic nationalism that has always been bitterly at odds with the rest of English-speaking Protestant Canada. In fact, English Canadians referred to Quebec as the priest-ridden province. Quebec remained heavily influenced by French thought and culture as before. According to Anne Roach Muggeridge in her book, The Desolate City, Revolution in the Catholic Church, a decade before Vatican II, Quebec's universities were infiltrated with the thought of France's radical left. The school of thought made its way into Quebec's seminaries, corrupting the minds of seminarians who went on to be ordained. Some eventually consecrated bishops, carrying their modernist agenda with them in their episcopal duties. The church had always had a strong hold over Quebec society, owning and running all the hospitals and schools, but one incident revealed a widespread discontent with the church. In 1960, a book was published harshly criticizing the education system, claiming it favored the elite over the rural working class. The criticisms had hit a nerve. The book was a bestseller and sold more than 100,000 copies. Right around this time, an anti-clericalist campaign of secularization was underway in Quebec. Known as the Quiet Revolution, biased textbooks depicted as the triumph of Anglican rational Protestantism over an ignorant and backward Catholic regime. But it remains the case that Catholics, some of the members of the Church herself, infected with modernist ideas and itching for rebellion, helped the revolution along. Among these was Cardinal Paul-Émile Léger, one of the fathers of the Quiet Revolution. He was Archbishop of Montreal, one of the most important sees in Quebec, as well as president of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops in the early 1950s. He was among dissenting clergy who supported the idea that marriage did not necessarily exist for procreation. And in 1962, he wrote a letter to the Pope objecting to the Orthodox preparatory schema of Vatican II. Other cardinals soon signed his letter in support, leading eventually to rejection of the schema, a great coup for progressive clergy. He's credited with much of the declericalization of Quebec during the Quiet Revolution. We also have the Gang of Five to thank, a group of progressive Canadian bishops who exercised great influence over other clergy in Canada. The Gang of Five included bishops Alexander Carter, his brother Gerald Emmett Carter, Philip Francis Pocock, Joseph Plourde, and George Flahiff. Every single one of these men served at one point or another as president of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. Bishop Alexander Carter of Sault Ste. Marie was, among other things, chair of the Winnipeg meeting that produced the infamous Winnipeg Statement in 1967. More on that later. His brother, Archbishop Gerald Emmett Carter of Toronto, worked closely with Annabelle Bonini at the Second Vatican Council and helped implement his radical reforms. Archbishop Pocock of Toronto also played a leading role in helping produce the heterodox Winnipeg Statement. Archbishop Joseph Plourde of Ottawa had no problem welcoming progressive Catholic Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau to his cathedral for Mass in the 1970s. And Archbishop George Flahiff of Winnipeg, one of the fathers of the Second Vatican Council, hinted at the possibility of women's ordination. All of these men were friends and worked closely together and shared a progressive vision for the Church. Their influence on the priests and faithful of their diocese, as well as on brother bishops throughout the years of the Revolution, cannot be measured. Another leading Catholic figure, also considered a father of the Quiet Revolution, was a Dominican priest, Father Georges-Henri Lévesque. L'évêque studied at the Dominican College in Ottawa before attending the Catholic University of Lille in France. At the time, the French Dominicans were infected with communist ideas. In fact, the Catholic philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand said their preaching was so communist that Pope Pius XII came close to suppressing the order because of this. Father L'évêque himself said he was deeply influenced by French thought.
Most of the writers who influenced me in being interested in social affairs were French, like Le Comte de Main, Lamennais, who spoke so well about freedom with Montalembert and Lacordaire. Lacordaire was a Dominican. And I wanted to really specialize in social sciences in France. And when I went to France in 1930, just to make those special studies, I nearly kissed the motherland, you know, because it meant something to me.
Although Father L'évêque rejected atheistic communism and socialism, he promoted what some deem a Catholic version of socialism called social credit. When he returned to Canada, he became one of the most influential social activists in Quebec, leading a pro-union movement and founding the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Laval. There, he shaped the minds of future leaders, including Member of Parliament René Lévesque and Quebec politician Pierre Trudeau, both of whom would radically alter the political landscape and push it in a more liberal direction. Lévesque's Faculty of Social Science molded a generation of union organizers. He also ran a Dominican retreat house where he hosted hundreds of conferences debating the role of the church in modern society. Lévesque has been called a liberal Catholic, a Christian humanist, and a social democrat. His progressive ideas caused him to clash with Orthodox clergy as well as with the conservative premier Maurice Duplessis, a strong opponent of trade unions and socialism.
Well, didn't some of the bishops think that freedom was a very dangerous idea?
Yes, even not only the bishops, but the politicians in those times. They were going to the province, and they were always speaking about the authority. We have to respect the authority, the religious authority, and the political one, and they are both, as Mr. Duplessis said, both are linked together. When we despise one, we despise the other.
But at all times, Lévesque had the full support of the Dominican order. The Quiet Revolution erupted partly in reaction to the conservative regime of Maurice Duplessis. His party, the Union Nationale, was the ruling party since 1944. The revolutionaries saw it as traditional clericalist and opposed to progress. Duplessis himself was a Catholic deeply influenced by Saint André Bessette, the Canadian miracle worker. Duplessis promoted Quebec's autonomy and a strong French Catholic nationalism. Under his regime, Quebec adopted a new flag that paid honor to both France and the Catholic faith. It depicted a white cross against a blue background with 4 fleurs-de-lis, the symbol of France and of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Throughout his reign, Duplessis sought a close working relationship between the Catholic Church and the state. The Church likewise supported his policies. After nearly 2 decades under Duplessis, the revolutionaries won a victory when a new liberal government came to power in 1960. The motto of the new premier, Jean Lesage, was, "It's time for a change." The aim of the anti-clerical revolutionaries was to modernize Quebec, and part of this involved the removal of the church's monopoly over education, hospitals, and social services. Lesage's cabinet set about wresting control from the Catholic Church. Within a year, he had removed church control over schools, and within 3 years, from hospitals. Maurice Roy, Archbishop of Quebec, objected to the reforms at the time, but to no avail. The Quiet Revolution coincided with the radical changes made in the so-called spirit of Vatican II, liturgical innovations, dissent from church teachings on sexuality, an emphasis on collegiality rather than papal authority, downplaying of dogma on hell and mortal sin, coupled with the rise of feminism and the social justice movement. The Vatican II document Dignitatis Humanae was used as an excuse to put distance between the Church and the state. In the words of one commentator, just as the Quebec state was declaring its autonomy from the church was itself affirming the autonomy of political society and freedom of individual consciences. Father Gregory Baum claimed this newfound understanding of conscience and autonomy allowed Catholics greater freedom to criticize the church. Politically speaking, the large Catholic contingent in the National Assembly began to diminish, and there was no longer left a faction of faithful Catholics to fight against anti-life laws. Such laws passed easily in Quebec in the 1970s under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, a progressive Catholic who introduced the notion that you could be personally opposed to abortion, yet publicly support it, a possible inspiration for Catholic Governor Mario Cuomo in his infamous 1984 speech at Notre Dame, where he offered the same rationalization. And whenever Pierre Trudeau showed up to Mass at the cathedral in Ottawa, he was welcomed by Archbishop Joseph Plourde, another influential prelate who contributed to the destruction of the faith in Canada. So revolutionaries within the church helped orchestrate the revolution, while discontented laymen in positions of power carried forward their agenda in the public square. And weak bishops and clergy simply went along, choosing compromise in the spirit of pluralism and tolerance. Within a mere 2 decades, the church had been marginalized, the religious nationalism of old Quebec giving way to a secular nationalism where Catholicism was no longer relevant. Names of organizations were scrubbed clean of all Catholic references. So the Confederation of Catholic Workers became the Confederation of National Trade Unions. The Corporation of Catholic Teachers became the Department of Teachers of Quebec. The Catholic Union of Farmers became the Union of Agricultural Production, and the League of the Sacred Heart became the Christians Today. The practice of the faith in Quebec suffered. Priests and religious left their vocations in droves. In 1961, there were 46,000 priests and 45,000 religious. In the span of only 20 years, the number of priests had dropped to half. By 1981, to only 23,000, and religious to only 24,000. This was accompanied by a sharp drop in Mass attendance that continues to this day, from 90% in 1958 to a mere 6% today. And unlike in the U.S., immigration has not made up for the loss of Catholics in the pews. Although 84% of Québécois still identified themselves as Catholic, they're Catholic in name only. Quebec has some of the highest rates of abortion, cohabitation, illegitimacy, and suicide in the world. In fact, half of all pregnancies there end in abortion, and of those pregnancies brought to term, nearly half of newborns go unbaptized. In the words of one priest, these more often than not end up being baptized pagans because they grow up never seeing the inside of a church and never knowing their faith. Church after church has been closed and sold off. In 2003, Quebec had 2,751 churches. Since then, more than 400 have closed and 160 been demolished. That's one church closure per week. Many of the majestic churches in the province now stand abandoned, some even converted into condos, community centers, theaters, or even gyms. Those that remain open devise ways to raise money and draw crowds, like renting office space, running non-denominational nurseries, or even hosting rock concerts. Quebec is merely a microcosm of the betrayal and collapse of the faith in the rest of Canada. It just so happened that the collapse took place in Quebec first. Once a beacon of faith for the rest of Catholic Canada, Quebec now set an example of infidelity and compromise. If Quebec itself could not hang on to the faith, then how would Catholics in other provinces hang on to it, where they were the minority? It's no surprise the rest of Canada followed Quebec's lead, with declines in the Catholic population and Mass attendance in every province, as well as growth in religious disaffiliation everywhere. With that background in place, let's turn to a symptom of this revolution, one of the most infamous documents issued in the history of the Church, the Winnipeg Statement, the Canadian Bishop's Declaration of Open Rebellion. Nearly a half-century later, it is yet to be repudiated. The Winnipeg Statement marks a watershed moment for the Church in Canada, when the bishops capitulated to dissent, setting themselves on a path to a weakened and emasculated hierarchy. What many don't know is that the draft version of the Winnipeg Statement originally failed to garner enough votes to pass. Within less than 2 days, however, a number of bishops reversed course and changed their vote from no to yes. What took place in those 2 days to change the minds of these bishops? Why did so many go from rejecting this heterodox statement to accepting it, and in such a short period of time? Let's unpack the events surrounding the Winnipeg Statement to see what happened. When the birth control pill was introduced on a mass scale in 1960, the floodgates were opened not only to massive social evils in the world, but to dissent within the Church as well. In response to the voices advocating change, Pope John XXIII convened the Pontifical Commission on Birth Control in 1963 to study the issue. Some of the loudest voices raised in dissent came from Canada, especially from her clergy. The Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops was complicit in this long before it issued Winnipeg. For instance, in 1966, in response to Canada's law banning the sale of contraception, instead of supporting the law, the Canadian bishops opposed it as, quote, inadequate, and even encouraged lay faithful to change the law. In 1967, a Catholic conference titled Theology of the Renewal of the Church was held in Toronto. Speakers included progressive clergy like Cardinal Leo Joseph Sunens, Cardinal Paul-Émile Lezay, Fathers Edward Skilebex, Karl Rahner, Bernard Lonergan, and others. These clergy pushed to relax church teaching on contraception. Father Gregory Baum, a priest who was eventually excommunicated, was one of the theological consultants, or periti, at Vatican II. He led the vanguard of the dissent. In 1964, he contributed to a book titled Contraception and Holiness, which was presented as, quote, a balanced and perceptive declaration of Christian dissent, closed quote. In 1966, the Toronto Globe and Mail published an interview with Baum titled Catholics May Use Contraceptives Now. And in 1967, the same paper quoted Baum as saying that even if the Pope were to declare contraception impermissible, his judgment would be irrelevant. Around the same time, Canadian dioceses started giving out confessional norms contrary to church teaching, and in Ontario, priests were being told that if doctors can be confused about the science behind the pill, then priests can be confused about the morality of the pill. The catalyst came on the Feast of St. James, July 25, 1968, when Pope Paul VI published Humanae Vitae, reaffirming the Church's perennial teaching forbidding the use of contraception, a teaching that has always and everywhere been believed by the Church and therefore belongs to the ordinary infallible magisterium, which requires the full assent and obedience of the faithful. On July 30th, newspapers across Canada printed numerous comments criticizing Humanae Vitae. Among them included Father Baum's claim that Catholics had the right to dissent. In the following months, he traveled and spoke in Canada and the United States promoting his views, and he published articles one after the other with the following titles: Catholics May Follow Their Conscience, The Right to Dissent, and The New Encyclical on Contraception. Numerous Catholic pressure groups arose, all claiming the Freedom of Conscience banner. The Western Canadian Conference of Priests, the Canadian Institute of Theology, the Catholic Physicians Guild of Manitoba, and Catholics in Dialogue were among the dissenters. More than a dozen directors of departments at the Canadian Catholic Conference rejected Humanae Vitae, along with 58 signatories from Catholic St. Francis Xavier University. But no one was prepared for what would take place at Winnipeg. In the words of Monsignor Vincent Foy, longtime champion of Humanae Vitae, quote, the curtain was set to rise on a Canadian tragedy. If we had known the extent of the moral havoc to be launched by the Winnipeg Statement, I think we would all have been weeping, bishops, priests, and people. The Canadian bishops met at the Fort Garry Hotel on Monday, September 23, 1968, with the aim of issuing a response to Humanae Vitae. In addition to the approximately 75 bishops present were also experts who acted as consultants, all of whom dissented on Humanae Vitae. Father Edward Sheridan, one of the consultants, circulated Karl Rahner's paper rejecting Humanae Vitae. To counteract this, Monsignor Foy sent in a 2-page paper criticizing Rahner's position to be circulated among the consultants and bishops, but it was suppressed by Foy's own Archbishop Philip Pocock of Winnipeg. Archbishop Pocock's consultant was Father Gregory Baum. Bishop Alexander Carter, head of the Conference of Bishops at the time and chair of the Winnipeg meeting, also helped ensure the progressives got the outcome they wanted. The consultants, along with a theological commission of 11 bishops, were tasked with researching and drafting the Winnipeg Statement. The consultants drafted statements which would go to the 11-member commission and be returned with comments or criticisms. This continued until Tuesday morning, when a draft statement was submitted to the full Assembly of Bishops. The vote was scheduled to take place Wednesday, a calculated move to deprive the bishops sufficient time for in-depth study and reflection, instead pressuring them to come to a quick conclusion. During the drafting, Bishop Remy des Roux of Victoria, head of the Theological Commission, proposed a statement diverging from Humanae Vitae, calling for the, quote, right of freedom to follow conscience, end quote, on the matter of contraception. The consultants unanimously agreed, but the 11-member Theological Commission voted down his proposal 8-3, revealing a deep split among the bishops. Bishop André Ouellette, co-chair of the Theological Commission, fought against des Roux' formulation, and with the help of his consultant, Father Edward Gagnon, drafted an orthodox statement that got majority support in the Theological Commission. Quote, we are at one with the Holy Father in his teaching and pastoral concern about conjugal love and responsible parenthood, closed quote. It was this revised statement, fully in line with Catholic teaching, that went to the floor of the Assembly for a vote. But the consultants strongly voiced their objection, presenting an ultimatum to all the bishops: adopt des Roux' formulation, or else a pastoral disaster will fall upon Canada. Bishop des Roux stood in front of the bishops and made his case for dissent. He argued that although the Theological Commission voted 8-3 against des Roux' formulation, the consultants were unanimous in their approval. He challenged the bishops not to blindly accept Humanae Vitae, but rather to have a broader vision on this issue. Voting commenced. The crisis point had arrived. Would the bishops remain faithful to church teaching, or would they dissent? Des Roux' words were convincing enough because when the tally was taken, his position carried the day. His heterodox formulation won a simple majority by a single vote. To adopt the statement, though, a 2/3 majority was needed. This was accomplished through an emergency meeting Thursday night, where des Roux got the necessary votes. We don't know who determined an emergency existed or what constituted the emergency. We don't know what happened in this emergency meeting. We don't know what caused so many bishops to reverse course. And we don't know the number of bishops who turned. No one seems to have the answers. But someone does.
Jesus never commanded anyone. He always respected their freedom.
We can only speculate that in the meeting, des Roux, with the consultants' unanimous backing, continued to hammer his case for dissent, giving dire enough warnings about the impending disaster to the church if his brother bishops failed to adopt his more pastoral formulation. We may never know what he and his dissenting colleagues said to make so many bishops turn, but what we do know is that the vote count as of Wednesday was somewhere around 38-37. And Thursday night, that vote count changed to approximately 50 in favor to 25 against des Roux. We say approximately because we know a handful of bishops left in protest before the final vote was taken. And Friday morning, bishops were still voicing complaints. One bishop made a last-ditch effort to object to the proceedings, but Bishop Carter ruled him out of order. It was official. The Canadian bishops had adopted the Winnipeg Statement. The fatal blow had been struck. At a press conference Friday afternoon, the statement was announced to the public. In the words of Monsignor Foy, quote, "In truth, by the Winnipeg Statement, Canadian bishops became promoters of mass murder and complicit in turning thousands of sewers into tombs," closed quote. Why mass murder? Because the birth control pill also acts as an abortifacient. It can prevent a fertilized egg from implanting. That fertilized egg is no mere clump of tissue. He's a unique human being created in the image of God with an immortal soul. When the egg can't implant, he dies and is then expelled from his mother's body to end up in the sewers. It is this the Canadian bishops gave the okay to when they adopted the Winnipeg Statement. Paragraph 26 is the key paragraph. Concerning the use of birth control, it reads in part, quote, "Whoever honestly chooses that course which seems right to him does so in good conscience," close quote. With this single statement, the Canadian bishops went against 2,000 years of Catholic doctrine by essentially telling the faithful they could decide for themselves whether or not to use contraception. The Church has always taught that the use of contraception to prevent birth is intrinsically evil. One may never perform an intrinsic evil under any circumstances, no matter how supposedly good the outcome. But paragraph 26 of the Winnipeg Statement tells Catholics the opposite, that they may weigh the good and bad of their situation and, quote, "in good conscience, choose contraception to prevent birth." Betraying their role as shepherds of their flocks, the Canadian bishops placed untold numbers of souls, including their own, on the path to hell through this act of treachery. In the words of Anne Roach Muggeridge in her book, The Desolate City, quote, "The hierarchical magisterium officially surrendered. It established the Protestant principle as the norm that Canadian Catholics might follow in their practice of sexual ethics," closed quote. In addition to the moral and spiritual evils introduced by the Winnipeg Statement, the social evils have been manifold. The contraceptive mentality has led to high rates of abortion, adultery, cohabitation, divorce, single-parent homes, children born out of wedlock, pornography, homosexuality, and child abuse, not to mention a proliferation of invalid marriages. The Winnipeg Statement was a defining moment for the Canadian bishops. They had the choice between authentic leadership by fidelity to the magisterium or moral cowardice by way of dissent. They chose the latter, rejecting their role as guardians of the faith. From that moment on, they set themselves on a trajectory towards a mediocre and morally confused leadership from which they have hardly recovered. Another fallout from the Winnipeg Statement is that the bond of unity between the Canadian bishops and the Holy See was weakened. Since the Canadian bishops issued a statement not in union with Rome, the Winnipeg Statement carries no magisterial weight at all, and no Catholic is bound to heed its words. This informal break from Rome gave the impression of creating a national church in Canada. In the words of the Toronto Catholic Register after the Winnipeg Statement, quote, "In Canada, perhaps for the first time in our history, we can now become a truly Canadian church in the deepest sense of the word," closed quote. In addition, the faithful lost trust in their shepherds to teach sound Catholic doctrine. Priests were harmed too. Those who spoke against the Winnipeg Statement suffered persecution from their bishops or brother priests, or suffered rejection by their parishioners, who did not want to be told it was a mortal sin to use birth control. Monsignor Foy himself said his own Archbishop, Philip Pocock, wrote him a letter after the Winnipeg Statement was adopted and told him to absolve in the confessional those who in good conscience used contraception. With such directions being given by bishops, it's not surprising that confusion reigned in the confessional, where the faithful were sometimes told that using contraception was allowed. In addition to the growing silence from the pulpits, the lines for confession gradually diminished, as fewer and fewer Catholics felt the need to confess their use of birth control. The poison of the Winnipeg Statement quickly spread through the education system. Seminaries opened their doors to dissenting professors, and textbooks teaching paragraph 26, some with imprimaturs from the bishops, were taught in Canada and around the world. Marriage prep courses also spread Winnipeg's error, and do so to this day. The Canadian bishops' guidelines on family life education, as well as the bishops' marriage kits, promote paragraph 26. And the Mosaic marriage preparation course stated that with regard to birth control, quote, The bishops of Canada have said that those who have chosen the way which seems the best for them live in the love of God, close quote. The Catholic family has suffered the most. Catholics in Canada divorce, contracept, and abort at about the same rate as non-Catholics. Contraception has also paved the way for demographic disaster. Canada has not experienced a replacement level birth rate since 1971. The latest stats show Canada's birth rate is only 1.6 per woman, when at least 2.1 per woman are needed to keep a stable population. The fallout from this means more senior citizens relying on government aid, with fewer and fewer youth to join the workforce, pay taxes, and help fuel the economy. If levels continue to fall, Canada will face economic ruin. Monsignor Foy sent a detailed critique of the Winnipeg Statement to Pope Paul VI shortly after its publication. The Pope's Secretary of State responded with gratitude, calling Foy a true Christian for his fidelity to church teaching. The same could not be said for the Canadian bishops who continued in their infidelity. In 1969, the Canadian bishops, as a body, reaffirmed Winnipeg, stating, quote, "We stand squarely behind our position," close quote. A secret ballot was taken by the Canadian bishops in 1998 on a resolution to reject the Winnipeg Statement. The measure failed to pass. Canadians saw a glimmer of hope when the bishops published the pastoral letter Liberating Potential in 2008 on the 40th anniversary of Humanae Vitae. Although not a formal retraction of the Winnipeg Statement, the Canadian bishops seemed to have finally acknowledged the soundness of the Church's teaching on contraception, admitting the prophetic character of Humanae Vitae in light of the, quote, troubling evolution of marriage and the family, closed quote. In spite of this letter, a formal retraction of Winnipeg is yet to be made. The Winnipeg Statement represents a shameful and tragic episode in the life of the Church in Canada, which, in addition to paving the way for so many moral and social evils, also placed countless souls in danger of hell, something for which the Canadian bishops must give an account on the Day of Judgment. Although the bishops more recently seem to have reversed course on the issue of contraception, a formal retraction of the Winnipeg Statement must be issued, accompanied by an apology by the bishops for having betrayed and misled their flock for so many years. The Winnipeg Statement needs to be publicly and formally rejected by Canada's bishops and relegated to the trash heap of heretical history where it belongs. Church Militant has reported on the American bishops before and how they've been in hot water for giving money to pro-gay and pro-abortion outfits through their charitable groups, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, the CCHD, and Catholic Relief Services, CRS. But the bishops here in Canada haven't been much better. Their international charitable arm, the Canadian Catholic Organization for Development and Peace, located in this building right here in downtown Montreal on the 3rd floor, has been caught in similar scandals, giving money, Catholic money, to leftist groups that promote contraception and abortion. And the evidence shows they've hardly cleaned up their act.
Você quer ser padre. Você sabe o que é ser padre.
In 1967, Brazilian Archbishop Helder Camara, one of the founders of Marxist liberation theology, said to the Canadian bishops, quote, "We do not want aid, we want social justice." Inspired by his example and in response to his request, the Canadian bishops established Development and Peace, or DNP, as their official international charitable arm. It's significant that it's headquartered in Quebec, the epicenter of the revolution. We spoke with Patrick Crane at LifeSite News in Canada, who gives some background on Development and Peace.
They were founded in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, and they were intended as a lay-run humanitarian organization working with groups on the ground in developing countries to improve living conditions. Now, they often portray themselves as a relief organization. When they have their Lenten campaigns, they show, pictures of the poor and food and this kind of thing. So people often think that when they're giving money to Development and Peace, they're sending food to the Third World. But much of the funding that it sends is actually directed towards political activities, combating big corporations and industries like mining or agriculture.
DNP's stated mission is to help break the cycle of poverty in the Third World. Nearly half its funds come from parish collections, while the rest comes from government grants and personal donations. It claims, quote, "The funds we send abroad support grassroots organizations run by people who know firsthand the issues facing the developing world," closed quote. The problem is that some of these grassroots organizations are directly at odds with Catholic teaching. LifeSite News started reporting on DNP back in 2000 when DNP was promoting and financially supporting the World March for Women, a feminist pro-abortion event. A 2009 investigation by LifeSite News revealed that DNP was funding dozens of questionable groups from 13 countries. When LifeSite contacted DNP with their report before going to air, you'll be amazed by DNP's response.
When we called Development and Peace, their director of international programs told us, and this is a quote, he said, "We don't have a policy for or against abortion. The criterion is not pro-life or pro-abortion." So they were happy to fund pro-abortion groups. It didn't matter to them.
Let's turn to their investigation in Mexico. It revealed that DNP gave $170,000 to 5 charities there that promote contraception and abortion. One of them, Como Letzin, received $32,000 in 2007 and 2008. This group admits having tried to help a girl get an abortion, and one of its offices proudly displayed a giant banner that read, quote, "Violence is forcing a girl to carry a pregnancy. We demand the return of therapeutic abortion," closed quote. Other pro-abortion groups in Mexico funded by Development and Peace include the All Rights for Everyone Network, the Miguel Augustin Pro Juarez Human Rights Center, the Mexican Network for Action Regarding Free Trade, the Center for Economic and Political Research for Community Action, and the National Center for Social Communication. All of these groups are pro-abortion, and all of them have received money from the Canadian Bishops' Conference. Dozens of other pro-abortion charities have received funding as well. Rural Women's Movement, based in Brazil, received thousands from DNP. This group openly fights against pro-life laws in their country. When a commission was created to investigate illegal abortions in Brazil, Rural Women's Movement wrote a letter protesting the creation of this commission. Another group in Brazil, called the Federation of Organs for Social and Educational Assistance, has openly endorsed legalization of abortion, and their website promotes the National Feminist Network for Health, Sexual Rights, and Reproductive Rights, which, as their name indicates, supports abortion access for women. If we turn to Africa, we see that DNP has given funds to a group called Faux Coopers, which lobbies for legalization of abortion in East Timor. Another group that does the same and which has received grant money from Development and Peace is Rede Photo. KFAM in Haiti, a group that publicly promotes abortion and contraception on its website, has also benefited from DNP. We could name dozens more groups in Nicaragua, Nigeria, the Philippines, South Africa, Thailand, Togo, and Peru. But you get the picture. In fact, the Peruvian bishops were so scandalized the bishops in Canada were funding pro-abortion groups in Peru that they wrote an open letter asking them to stop. In May 2009, they wrote, quote, "It is very disturbing to have groups which work against the bishops of Peru funded by our brother bishops in Canada," closed quote. Let that sink in. It is very disturbing to have groups which work against the bishops of Peru funded by our brother bishops in Canada. After LifeSite News presented a report of these funding practices to the Canadian bishops, they were met with denial. Not only did the Canadian bishops lie, they lied about the allegations, they also failed to address most of the concerns. On top of that, they blamed LifeSite News for what they claimed were unfair accusations, going so far as to slander this faithful Catholic apostolate by calling it, quote, "a counter-witness to the gospel," closed quote. In short, their response was pathetic. Some bishops, however, offered a more promising response. Toronto Cardinal Thomas Collins was the first bishop to say he would withhold funds to DNP from his diocese until the problems were cleared up. He called for a thorough investigation. DMP felt the blow since Toronto gives more than $1 million out of the $10 million DMP receives annually. Other bishops have also cut off funding. Bishop Michael Mulhall of Pembroke urged Catholics to stop giving to DMP and only donate to charities vetted by his diocese. DMP is only one among a number of Catholic organizations with scandalous grant-making practices. For decades, similar problems existed with the Vatican's Caritas Internationalis, France's Secours Catholique, and in America with Catholic Charities, Catholic Relief Services, and the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. In response to these ongoing scandals, Pope Benedict issued a motu proprio in 2009 entitled Caritas in Veritate, Charity in Truth. In it, he set forth clear guidelines requiring that all Catholic agencies ensure their funding practices are consistent with Catholic teaching. In light of the Pope's letter, the Canadian bishops announced in 2010 that DMP would undergo renewal. The agency promised it would work more closely with the bishops to ensure its funding would be more in line with Catholic teaching. But in spite of this promise, DMP once again became mired in scandal the same year when it invited the head of a Mexican pro-abortion charity to speak at one of its events. Father Luis Arriaga, president of the pro-abortion group the Miguel Pro Center for Human Rights, was scheduled to speak in Ottawa at the invitation of DMP when Archbishop Terence Pendergast intervened and canceled his talk. As the Canadian bishops tried to reassert control of DMP, 22 employees resigned in protest. One theologian who had worked there for nearly 40 years also quit, writing an angry public letter accusing the bishops of, quote, shameful blackmail. And other employees attacked the bishops for what they called, quote, a retrograde concept of the church, close quote. Add to this the fact that the Canadian government slashed funding to the agency by $5 million, or 65%, in 2012. This was spurred by a report revealing that DMP had received the lowest rating for governance and finance out of 15 Canadian charities. And that fall, in a first, the Canadian bishops intervened to halt DNP's education campaign after complaints it was too politically focused. Quebec media claimed DMP was in its final agony and death throes. If only that were true. In spite of the shakeup, renewal is hardly complete, and Catholics remain skeptical. During DMP's fundraising campaign in Lent of 2013, the agency spoke much on poverty, economic justice, and the environment, yet failed to breathe a word about the right to life. And it remains difficult to give an accurate picture of DMP's current funding practices because it refuses to make public its list of grantees. It freely offered this list in 2009, but since the LifeSite News expose, DMP has clamped down. In fact, it went to court in 2010 to block a LifeSite News request for its list.
Because they were not giving us the list, they weren't giving anybody the list, we eventually filed an access to information request with the Canadian government to obtain the list. And the reason we were able to do that is because the Canadian government funds Development of Peace. They give them a lot of money. But Development of Peace filed a claim with the Canadian federal court in order to block the request. And in the end, we were given a redacted version, but that wasn't useful because they had redacted so much that it didn't tell us anything.
DMP has also scrubbed its website of any evidence of questionable partnerships. Where once there were names proudly on display a few short years ago, the site is now sanitized and has hardly any names that appear on it. For a group that calls for transparency from others, DMP is strangely secretive about its own operation. In spite of this, evidence still exists to prove the agency is promoting groups opposed to Catholic teaching. On its website, you can find at least 2 groups that hold anti-Catholic positions. One of them is a charity in Haiti that promotes the use of contraception, and another is a charity in Cambodia that supports laws in favor of abortion. Both groups are positively profiled on the DNP website. One wonders just how totally committed the Canadian bishops are as a body to wholesale, authentic reform. Pope Benedict made clear in Caritas in Veritate that true charity can never come at the neglect of the soul. Yet, DMP and other so-called Catholic charities like it consistently flout this principle by funding or promoting causes that bring grave spiritual harm to souls. Until DMP shows complete fidelity to the Church and stops giving Catholic money to anti-life groups, no Catholic should support it with his money. Let's turn our attention now to Catholic schools in Canada, specifically in Ontario, the site of a fierce battle to force the gay agenda in the province's Catholic schools. The destruction of Catholic identity in Ontario's schools over the past few decades is nothing short of meteoric. With the introduction of textbooks like Born in the Spirit, which offers an utterly inadequate explanation of the faith, or Fully Alive, a sex ed program that fails to teach modesty or chastity, Catholic schools in the province are hardly known for orthodoxy. The problem is that Catholic schools are fully funded by the government, a right guaranteed in Canada's Constitution, but their acceptance of government money comes with many strings attached. Public schools in Canada have for a number of years hosted gay student clubs called Gay-Straight Alliances, or GSAs for short. They were begun in the United States in 1988.
Gender and sexual diversity.
10 years later, the first GSA appeared in British Columbia in Canada and have since spread to the rest of the world. Catholic schools, though, were forbidden to have any gay student clubs because they implied acceptance of homosexual sin, condemned in Catholic teaching. According to the Ontario bishops, they, quote, imply a self-identification with sexual orientation that is often premature among high school students, close quote.
To some people, school is a second home, and for me, I think it's a second home to me.
The infiltration of the gay agenda in Ontario Catholic schools first made headlines more than a decade ago when in 2002, a gay student challenged his school's ban on bringing his gay partner to the senior prom. He took the case to court and won. The school had considered canceling the dance altogether, but the court forced the school to go ahead with it, gay partners and all. The student eventually dropped the lawsuit, but it had the intended effect of dampening Catholic resistance to the gay agenda by education leaders and bishops across the country. The first time the issue of gay-straight alliances in Catholic schools came up was in 2010, with a directive from the Ministry of Education called the Equity and Inclusive Education Strategy. Its aim was to make schools more welcoming to the homosexualist agenda. It recommended that all schools, secular and Catholic, allow GSAs. The directive was written by the lesbian Minister of Education, Kathleen Wynne, appointed by Catholic Premier Dalton McGuinty. The lesbian Minister of Education has gone on to become current Premier of Ontario and is responsible for ramming through a controversial sex ed curriculum in 2015 with graphic discussion of masturbation, same-sex acts, contraception, and gender theory, exposing this material to school children as young as age 6. The sex ed curriculum is mandatory in both secular and Catholic schools. But returning to the GSA mandate, the Institute for Catholic Education, which is the education arm of the Ontario bishops, was at the table with the government during the development of this mandate. The institute was headed by a progressive nun named Sister Joan Cronin, who had the full trust of the bishops to approve government curriculum for Catholic schools. The Institute for Catholic Education never objected to the GSA mandate, in spite of the existence of intense media pressure on Catholic schools to adopt the pro-gay directive. Overall, the bishop's response was weak and cowardly. In the end, all but 1 out of 29 Catholic school boards voted to approve student-led gay clubs, with the caveat that they not use the word gay in their name. This despite the fact that the directive was only a recommendation the boards could have declined. The one school board that did reject the mandate ended up reversing its policy after a massive international hate campaign by gay activists. The trustee who spearheaded the campaign against the church was an out-and-proud gay activist and Catholic named Paul Marai. Faithful Catholics had asked the bishops to intervene and pressure Marai to step down, but the bishops refused, saying, quote, "The law is the law." After the school board reversed its policy and in the absence of any leadership from the bishops, the spread of gay activism and GSAs in Catholic schools went wild.
As a Catholic high school club, we do not discuss nor promote sex or any act of sex.
In the spring of that year, a public campaign was brought against the Catholic bishops demanding that they allow schools to host gay student clubs. The student trustee of the Toronto Catholic District School Board presented a report to the board. The recommendations included the following: that all religion classes include anti-homophobia education as part of its curriculum, that schools set forth consequences for those who spread homophobia, that staff be educated on the dangers of homophobia, and that schools provide safe spaces for students to discuss, quote, the giftedness of sexual orientation, close quote. And this is in Catholic schools. After months of public pressure, the Ontario bishops gave in, and in April of 2011, they permitted Catholic schools for the first time to host gay student clubs. These clubs would address bullying in general, including bullying related to sexual orientation. These clubs, however, could not call themselves gay-straight alliances because, according to the head of the Catholic School Trustee Association, quote, the purpose of our clubs will be to provide support, not activism, close quote. Instead, Catholic bishops proposed calling such clubs respecting difference. The clubs were also forbidden to use the rainbow flag as their symbol. The first of such student meetings took place in a Catholic school in June of 2011. Critics were disappointed that the bishops capitulated. They argued these clubs were functionally GSAs, even if they lacked the name, and that they paved the way to welcoming the homosexualist agenda into Catholic schools. The critics would be proven right. In November of that year, Ontario Premier Dalton McGuinty proposed Bill 13, or the Accepting Schools Act. The bill would require all schools across the board, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, to host student clubs to deal with the issue of bullying. McGuinty was inspired to propose this bill on hearing of the suicides of two boys who had killed themselves that year, reportedly because of bullying. When it was first proposed, Bill 13 focused on bullying in general, with no specific focus on sexual orientation. Interestingly, in the same month that the bill was proposed, a Catholic school in Hamilton, Ontario, hosted a school-wide GSA assembly where a lesbian speaker told students the Bible got it wrong with regard to homosexuality.
I say that all of our students in all of our schools, whether public or Catholic, need to be safe.
The next month, the Education Minister, Laurel Broughton, proposed that Bill 13 would require all schools, including Catholic schools, to host gay-straight alliances, GSAs. Months of negotiations followed, during which the bishops and the government tried to work out the terms. The bishops hoped for a law more in line with Catholic teaching, one that would allow clubs to focus on bullying in general and not focus on gays specifically. The bishops also objected to naming their clubs gay-straight alliances. In January of 2012, the Catholic School Trustees Association issued a set of guidelines called Respecting Difference, meant as a resource on how to host and run anti-bullying clubs. The guide set forth its clear rejection of all forms of bullying and also cited the Catholic Catechism as the primary teaching document of the faith. The Catechism states in section 2357 that homosexual acts are, quote, acts of grave depravity, intrinsically disordered, and contrary to the natural law, close quote. The Ontario bishops hoped these guidelines would pass muster under Bill 13, and negotiations with the government seemed to be going well until May of 2012, when the bishops were blindsided by the government, which added an amendment making gay-straight alliances mandatory. Toronto Cardinal Thomas Collins, speaking on behalf of the Canadian bishops, objected, saying, quote, all forms of bullying need to be addressed, but it is not helpful to propose one particular way, such as the one commonly called GSA, closed quote. And elsewhere, he criticized the law for violating religious freedom by forcing Catholic schools to act against their faith. Pro-life leaders also voiced concern, saying Bill 13 was nothing more than an attempt to force Catholic schools to celebrate homosexuality.
Homophobia is a propaganda term invented by a gay activist many years ago and was designed for the purpose of falsely labeling and maligning Christians.
The bishops, along with the Catholic School Trustees Association, continued to voice objections up until the day of the vote, which was held on June 5, 2012, during Gay Pride Month, when gay pride parades are held all across North America. The Accepting Schools Act passed easily by a vote of 65 to 36.
The ayes are 65 and the nays are 36. I declare the motion carried.
Part of the text includes the following: that schools should be made, quote, more equitable and inclusive for all people, including LGBTTIQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, two-spirited, intersex, queer, and questioning people, closed quote. Catholic faithful who hoped the bishops would put up a fight would be sorely disappointed. Neither the bishops nor the Catholic schools in Ontario put up any resistance once the law was passed. We spoke with Jack Fonseca at Campaign Life Coalition in Canada, who's been closely tracking the rise of GSAs in Ontario.
The Ontario Liberal government just rammed the bill through, passed it, and immediately after it was passed, the bishops gave up their opposition and said, we will comply with this law, which was a punch in the gut to so many faithful Catholics. We got bummed when that happened, when the bishops came out and said, we're not going to fight this, we're going to comply with this law. We were bombarded with faithful Catholics asking us, what's going on? Where's the leadership on this? Why aren't we fighting this? This is clearly against Catholic teaching. GSAs are a gay pride club in essence. It's not truly about supporting students who've been bullied. This is really about promoting the homosexual lifestyle and normalizing it in the minds of children.
The same day as the bill's passage, Toronto Cardinal Thomas Collins issued a statement of capitulation. It read in part, quote, recognizing that the Accepting Schools Act is now the law, Catholic partners will seek, as we have always done, in a way that is in accord with our faith, to foster safe and welcoming school communities, closed quote. And equally as disappointing was the response from the Catholic School Trustees Association. Although it had earlier objected to the law on grounds of religious freedom, it now declined to challenge the law in court. Instead, the president stated, quote, we're encouraging our boards, our schools, and our administrators to comply with the law, closed quote. This capitulation has everything to do with their acceptance of government money. The Trustees Association issued a statement that read in part, quote, it is unfortunate that some of our concerns regarding Bill 13 were not addressed in the final version of this legislation, but as part of Ontario's strong and vibrant publicly funded system, Catholic school boards will comply with what will now be law, closed quote. On the same day the bill passed, the Elementary Teachers Federation encouraged teachers to start hosting GSAs in their own schools. Although church leaders said they would implement GSAs in a way that's in accord with the faith, it's clear students don't view things this way.
I was denied the right to organize a gay-straight alliance group.
One gay student, Christopher Karras, advertised his high school's GSA with a poster displaying a picture of Harvey Milk, a 1970s gay rights activist. The school took the posters down, claiming the image was too controversial. Karras then filed a complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, claiming homophobia. The Accepting Schools Act had a more far-reaching impact than simply enforcement of the gay agenda. In October of 2012, then Education Minister Laurel Broughton determined that the Accepting Schools Act also forbade Catholic schools from teaching that abortion is wrong. That's because, according to her, condemning a woman's choice of abortion would fall under the forbidden category of misogyny. According to the Education Minister, quote, Bill 13 is about tackling misogyny. Taking away a woman's right to choose could arguably be one of the most misogynistic actions that one could take, close quote. Other bills have also forced perverse ideology in Catholic schools. A federal identity bill, along with a gender identity bill, have been used to justify transgenderism at a Toronto Catholic school. In September of 2014, a lesbian mother demanded that her 6-year-old son be treated like a girl, being permitted to use the girls' restroom and changing room. Instead of fighting, the Catholic school gave in to her demands, fearing not to do so would run afoul of the law.
You know, this story came out in pro-family media that this had happened in a Catholic school. And again, we were bombarded at Campaign Life Coalition by faithful Catholics asking, where are the bishops on this? Why have the bishops not spoken out on this at all? We've not heard a single thing about this.
It's not just Ontario Catholic schools caving into this ideology. Vancouver Catholic schools have also adopted policies favorable to transgender students. In July 2014, in response to a human rights complaint filed by an 11-year-old transgender boy who goes by Tracy Wilson, the Vancouver Archdiocese approved a policy allowing transgender students to use bathrooms and wear uniforms based on their chosen gender. This is a first for any North American school and possibly for any school in the world. This means boys who think they're girls are now allowed to use girls' restrooms, wear female uniforms, and go by girls' names, and all in Catholic schools. And the Alberta government is also trying to ram transgender policies through in Catholic schools. The Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith wrote in a 1986 letter on the pastoral care of homosexuals that
no authentic pastoral program will include organizations in which homosexual persons associate with each other without clearly stating that homosexual activity is immoral. We wish to make it clear that departure from the Church's teaching or silence about it in an effort to provide pastoral care is neither caring nor pastoral. Only what is true can ultimately be pastoral. The neglect of the Church's position prevents homosexual men and women from receiving the care they need and deserve.
There was more fallout from the passage of Bill 13. The Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association had strongly supported GSAs from the beginning, and 3 years later, it made the stunning decision to march in Toronto's World Pride Parade. The union's president, James Ryan, justified the decision, stating, quote, "Our presence in this parade is a symbol of our support for students, teachers, and others in the LGBTQ community and the discrimination and persecution that they face," close quote. Bishops and Catholic faithful called for them to withdraw their presence, and Toronto Cardinal Thomas Collins met with Ryan, but with little success. Collins then issued a statement condemning the union. Catholic parents circulated a petition against the union's pro-gay position that garnered more than 5,000 signatures. None of this mattered to the Catholic Teachers Union, which marched in the parade anyway.
Well, I must say that it is not easy to answer such an ontological question.
And after the October 2014 Synod on the Family in Rome, in which the midterm relatio claimed that homosexuals have gifts and qualities to offer the Church, Catholic educators in Ontario lauded the more welcoming tone. Patrick Keys, Superintendent of Student Success and Equity and Inclusive Education in Toronto, welcomed the more inclusive language, while James Ryan, President of the Ontario English Catholic School Teachers Association, claimed the bishop's approach, quote, "is based on love and caring, and I think that's a good approach," closed quote. As of today, at least a dozen Catholic schools in Ontario host gay-straight alliances, although the number is likely much higher. According to Campaign Life Coalition, administration staff appears to have kept these clubs close to their chest and are not sharing information with the elected representatives charged with upholding the Catholic faith. So school trustees generally don't know where or how GSAs are operating. Since Ontario's acceptance of Bill 13, other provinces have passed similar laws.
The sweet part is we are announcing Bill 18 is law. 3 cheers for that.
In September of 2013, government officials in Manitoba voted to make GSAs mandatory in all schools, including private religious schools, passing a law heavily informed by Ontario's Bill 13. This time, not only Catholics but Protestants, Jews, and Muslims united to fight the law, to no avail. And a similar law was passed in Alberta on March 10, 2015, making GSAs mandatory in all schools in that province. Unless Catholic bishops and laity start doing serious battle against the rapid secularization of Catholic schools, it seems Catholic identity will continue to decline. Jack Fonseca sums it up well.
I really fear that our Catholic schools in Ontario have become places where children enter as baptized Catholics And after a period of years of being taught distorted teaching or not being taught what they should about Catholic doctrinal teaching, they come out the other end as non-believers. And we see this in the numbers. We see that very few Catholic students who come out of the Catholic school system end up actually going to church or end up believing what the church teaches. And we actually see a great number of them come out of grade 12, and they are very strongly opposed to Catholic moral teaching. So there's something very, very wrong with our Catholic school system, and it has spread right across the province. Unfortunately, it appears that in Catholic schools, the faith of our fathers, in many cases in these areas of sexual morality, has been turned into the doubts of our dissenters.
Catholics need to wake up and realize that at bottom, we are dealing with a spiritual war involving diabolical forces. The weak conciliatory approach adopted by the bishops has not worked, and as long as they continue to cede ground to secular powers, school children, the real victims here, will suffer the consequences in this life and in eternity. As we survey the landscape here in Canada, we see that the revolution came essentially in two parts. The first part began with revolutionaries within the church, infected with modernist ideas from their seminary formation. They infiltrated the ranks of the church and carried forward their progressive agenda, destabilizing and dismantling the once vibrant faith. Then came along the next generation of bishops and clergy who grew up under a more marginalized church, one no longer in control and now fighting for relevance. Although the new generation may not have had the same evil intent as the prior generation, they were taught to believe they must adopt an attitude of tolerance for the sake of pluralism. This explains why so few Canadian bishops have been willing to put up a fight over encroachments on the faith, instead choosing compromise and accommodation. There have been a few glimmers of hope here and there, and a handful of bishops have taken a stand against attacks on the faith, but they've been few and far in between. The bishops, as a body, are yet to evidence any real leadership, whether it's failing to issue a formal retraction of the infamous Winnipeg Statement, or only partly reforming development and peace, or giving little resistance to the gay agenda in schools. If the Canadian bishops are serious about rolling back the tide of secularism that's destroying the faith, they must commit as a body to doing serious battle for the soul of the church. They must reject weak and conciliatory approaches that they've taken so far and fight for the faith with the muscular fortitude expected from shepherds of the flock and princes of the church. This is what they were consecrated to do, and they must do so bravely without fearing backlash. As we read in Romans 8:31, if God is for us, who can be against us? The souls of nearly 13 million Canadian Catholics are under their care. They are looking for them, the bishops, looking to them for guidance and leadership. If the bishops expect to stand before God one day and hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant," then they must stop ceding ground to enemy forces, pick up their swords and start waging war for the souls of their flocks. Reporting to you from Montreal, the old city of Mary here in Quebec, this is Michael Voris for ChurchMilitant.com.